You're being deliberately obtuse, Eleanor. This isn't a debate, it's a family gathering. Just put the fork down and try to enjoy the gravy. My father's voice, usually a low rumble of authority, was tight, strained. The Hallmark Christmas movie soundtrack that had been humming in the background seemed to mock the sudden, suffocating tension that had descended upon the dining room. The roast turkey, perfectly golden, sat under a cloche, its promise of warmth and comfort now a distant, taunting memory. I looked at my plate, a landscape of untouched mashed potatoes and wilting green beans, and then at his face. His usual jovial Santa-like visage was contorted, the red blooming on his cheeks not from festive cheer, but from a simmering, familiar irritation. He was looking at me, but it felt like he was looking through me, at some annoying imperfection that had dared to mar the curated perfection of his holiday tableau. Just behave. Like a grown woman. My childhood Christmases were a delicate ballet of suppressed anxieties and forced merriment. My father, a man who built his empire on calculated risks and relentless control, viewed any deviation from his script as a personal affront. My mother, a creature of quiet, resigned grace, navigated these turbulent waters with a practiced, almost imperceptible weariness. My siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, had long ago learned to parrot his opinions, to blend seamlessly into the polished veneer he so carefully maintained. I, however, was the anomaly. I possessed a restless curiosity, a tendency to question, to feel things perhaps too deeply, and a refusal to simply accept the status quo. It wasn't rebellion, it was simply me. And in my father's world, being anything other than what he expected was akin to treason. He called it being dramatic. I knew it was just a polite term for being inconvenient. There was the time in high school, when I'd painstakingly researched the environmental impact of his company's new development on a local wetland, a project he'd hailed as a triumph of progress. I presented my findings, complete with data and expert opinions, at a family dinner. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by his slow, deliberate placing of his fork on his plate. "Eleanor," he'd said, his voice dangerously soft, "your mother and I have provided you with a good education. Perhaps it's time you used it for something constructive. Like learning to appreciate the sacrifices we make for this family. This isn't a university seminar." He'd then proceeded to lecture me for 45 minutes on fiscal responsibility and the realities of business, all while my mother busied herself refilling water glasses, her eyes never meeting mine. Or the year my sister announced her engagement. My father, ever the pragmatist, had immediately launched into a detailed financial analysis of her fiancé's career prospects and projected net worth. While everyone else cooed over the ring, I dared to ask about their wedding plans, about dreams, vision for their life together. My father had cut me off with a dismissive wave. "Details, Eleanor. We'll get to the details. First, the foundation must be solid. Marriage is a contract, you know. And contracts require due diligence." The hurt in my sister's eyes was a small, sharp shard that lodged itself in my chest. She later confided that she wished I'd just been happy for her, instead of making it about all that other stuff. But the other stuff, the emotional undercurrent, the unspoken anxieties, was precisely what I felt compelled to address. I learned to swallow my observations, to keep my thoughts locked away, a library of unspoken truths gathering dust. This Christmas Eve, the air crackled with an almost unbearable expectation. The house was a shrine to his success, polished mahogany, ancestral portraits, a Christmas tree so perfectly adorned it looked like it belonged in a magazine. My father, resplendent in a navy velvet blazer, was holding court at the head of the table, regaling the assembled family, my parents, my siblings and their spouses, a few select cousins, with tales of his latest business triumphs. I'd tried to contribute a story about a particularly challenging case I'd worked on as a junior associate at my law firm, something that had required immense patience and strategic thinking. And so, I'd begun, after weeks of careful negotiation, we finally managed to broker a settlement that satisfied both parties, averting a potentially devastating lawsuit for my client. It was a delicate dance, really, understanding each side's deepest fears and then finding the common ground. My father had interjected before I could even finish. Delicate dance, Eleanor? Sounds like you were just dithering. In business, you make a decision, you act. No room for sentimentality. You need to be decisive. Otherwise, you get steamrolled. He then launched into an anecdote about how he'd steamrolled a competitor out of a lucrative contract decades ago. The implicit comparison was clear, stinging. I felt a flush creep up my neck. My siblings nodded along, their expressions mirroring his resolute confidence. My mother offered a weak smile, her gaze flickering nervously between my father and me. I took a breath, trying to reassert a sliver of control over my own narrative. It's not dithering, Dad. It's strategy. It's about understanding the nuances of human psychology, which, as you know, is critical in any negotiation. That's when he delivered the line. The one that still echoed in the sterile silence of my mind, the one that had shattered the carefully constructed illusion of festive harmony. You're being deliberately obtuse, Eleanor. This isn't a debate, it's a family gathering. Just put the fork down and try to enjoy the gravy. Just behave. Like a grown woman. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The clinking of silverware abruptly ceased. My siblings' faces, for a fleeting moment, registered something akin to shock, quickly masked by practiced neutrality. My mother's hand, reaching for the gravy boat, froze mid-air. My father, his face a mask of paternal exasperation, continued to stare at me, waiting for my capitulation. He expected me to blush, to stammer an apology, to retreat into the comfortable anonymity he'd always preferred for me. But in that moment, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was a cold, clear realization. He didn't see me. He never had. He saw a project, an extension of his own will, a decorative element that sometimes threatened to clash with his aesthetic. And he was tired of being inconvenienced. Behave, he'd said. Like a grown woman. As if a grown woman was simply a compliant automaton, devoid of her own thoughts, her own feelings, her own experiences. The insult wasn't just in his words, it was in the casual dismissal, the public shaming, the utter lack of respect for my intelligence and my chosen profession. He had, in essence, declared war on my identity, right there, in front of everyone. And I, for the first time, refused to be the one who blinked. I looked at his smug, self-assured face, the slight smirk playing on his lips. He genuinely believed he had won, that he had put me in my place. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the distant sound of carols. I could feel the weight of every eye on me, waiting for the inevitable tears or outburst that would confirm his assessment of my drama. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my fork down, not with a clatter, but with a soft, precise click against the porcelain. I met his gaze directly, my own eyes devoid of the fear or hurt he expected. You know, I said, my voice unnervingly calm, you're absolutely right. This isn't a debate. It's a family gathering. And as a grown woman, I've realized something. I pushed my chair back, the scrape a surprisingly loud sound in the oppressive quiet. My father's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of confusion. My siblings leaned forward, their practiced indifference cracking. My mother's eyes widened, a silent question in their depths. I've realized, I continued, standing now, my gaze sweeping across their expectant faces, that sometimes, the most grown-up thing you can do is walk away from toxic situations. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse or plead. I simply stated a fact, a consequence. I turned, my movements unhurried, and walked towards the hallway. Behind me, I heard my father's voice, a sharp, disbelieving bark. Eleanor. Where do you think you're going? You can't just leave. I paused at the doorway, my hand on the cool, polished banister. I looked back at the tableau of forced festivity, at the man who had just, in his infinite wisdom, exiled his own daughter from his meticulously crafted world. Home, I said, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching my lips. To a place where I'm not considered obtuse or dramatic for simply being myself. Merry Christmas, Dad. And then I walked out. The heavy oak door closed behind me with a soft, final thud, cutting off the hushed murmurs and the faint strains of carols. The cold night air was a welcome shock against my skin. I didn't drive. I'd arranged for a car service hours earlier, a small contingency for an eventuality I'd always sensed was possible. As the sleek, dark sedan pulled up to the curb, the driver, a man named Michael who'd been with the service for years and knew my quiet discretion, simply opened the door. He didn't ask questions. He never did. The drive back to my apartment was silent. I watched the festive lights of the city blur past, each one a tiny, flickering ember of the warmth I had just been denied. I didn't feel triumphant, not yet. I felt a profound, almost unnerving sense of calm. The emotional dam that had held back years of silent resentment, of swallowed words, had finally broken. But instead of an explosion, there was a quiet, cleansing flow. The next morning, the phone calls began. First, my mother, her voice a trembling whisper. "Eleanor, darling, what happened? Your father is beside himself. He didn't mean it, you know. He was just stressed. The holidays are a lot." Her words were laced with her usual plea for peace, for reconciliation at any cost. I listened patiently, thanked her for her concern, and reiterated my stance. Then came my siblings. My eldest brother, the lawyer, the one who always sided with Dad, delivered a lecture on familial obligation and the importance of not burning bridges. My middle brother, the amiable appeaser, tried to broker a peace summit, suggesting I apologize for my overreaction. My sister, bless her heart, simply asked if I was okay, her voice laced with concern. Each conversation was a small test, a probing for weakness. I answered them all calmly, factually, explaining my decision without anger. The true fallout, however, began a few days later. It wasn't about Christmas dinner anymore. It was about leverage. My father, it turned out, had been relying on my tacit approval for a rather significant business deal. He was in the process of acquiring a controlling stake in a rival company, a move that required the signatures of all his children on a series of complex legal documents, essentially guaranteeing a portion of his personal assets as collateral. He'd assumed my compliance, just as he'd assumed my compliance at Christmas. He'd even casually mentioned the paperwork during the pre-dinner champagne reception, expecting a nod. My role as the dramatic one, the one who disrupted his perfect family narrative, had suddenly become a significant obstacle. I was the dissenting voice, the one he couldn't control. And as his junior associate, I had intimate knowledge of the finer points of his financial dealings, the precariousness of some of his investments, the little creative accounting he employed. My father called me, his voice a low growl, demanding I come to his office. "We need to finalize these documents, Eleanor. This deal is too important to let personal feelings interfere." I agreed to meet him, but not at his office. We met at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop downtown. He arrived bristling with impatience, ready to browbeat me into submission. I arrived with a single, unassuming manila folder. "Dad," I said, placing the folder on the table between us. "You said marriage is a contract, and contracts require due diligence. Well, I've done my due diligence on this acquisition." He looked at the folder, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "What is this?" "It's a preliminary assessment," I explained, my voice devoid of emotion. "Based on publicly available filings and a few anonymous tips I've received. It seems your rival isn't quite as financially sound as you believe. Their debt-to-equity ratio is significantly higher than reported, and there are several pending lawsuits that haven't been disclosed. This acquisition, at the price you're offering, is risky." His face paled. He snatched the folder and began flipping through the pages, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The smugness, the entitlement, was dissolving, replaced by a raw, desperate fear. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with panic. "Who gave you this?" This is a fabrication. Is it? I asked, sipping my lukewarm coffee. I believe the term you'd use is due diligence. And as a lawyer, I have a professional obligation to advise my clients, and in this case, my family, of potential liabilities. This deal could tank your entire empire, Dad. Especially if I were to share this information more widely. With the other shareholders, perhaps. Or the SEC. The color drained from his face entirely. The man who had exiled me for being dramatic was now utterly speechless, his carefully constructed world teetering on the brink. He had underestimated me, not just as a daughter, but as a professional. He had assumed I was merely emotional, when in reality, I was strategic. He stammered, You can't do this. This is blackmail. No, Dad, I corrected softly. This is consequence. You made a choice when you dismissed me, when you belittled my contributions. This is the outcome of that choice. He sat there, defeated, the manila folder clutched in his trembling hand. The noise of the coffee shop, the laughter, the clatter of cups seemed to fade into an irrelevant hum. He had no idea what was coming because he had never bothered to understand who I was. He saw drama, I saw leverage. He saw inconvenience, I saw opportunity. The deal collapsed. My father, forced to withdraw at the last minute, suffered significant financial and reputational damage. The anonymous tips had been remarkably accurate, and the ensuing investigations left him vulnerable. His carefully curated image of invincibility was shattered. He became the subject of hushed whispers in boardrooms, the man who had fumbled a sure thing. I never saw him again. And that Christmas. Or the next. Our family gatherings became a minefield, filled with strange silences and averted gazes. My siblings learned to navigate the new, fractured landscape, some still trying to bridge the chasm, others content to let it widen. My mother sent me more fruit baskets, her messages filled with thinly veiled anxieties. But I felt no regret. The satisfaction wasn't in his ruin, but in the quiet, indisputable knowledge that I had been underestimated, dismissed, and ultimately, profoundly misunderstood. And that, in the end, was his undoing. The holidays are now blessedly quiet. I spend them with friends, with people who value my presence, my thoughts, my genuine contributions. The memory of that Christmas dinner, of his dismissive words and his subsequent downfall, serves not as a scar, but as a cold, clear testament to the power of quiet resilience and the devastating consequences of hubris.